What's up, ladies and gents? Happy summer. I'm just here to record a quick video in which we review the June 2023 Regents, because I know a lot of you want to review the previous exam as part of your studies for the next one, and the August 2023 Regents is coming pretty quickly. So let's get into the exam, shall we? So this is the first page and the first question, and it corresponds to something that you don't see on the Regents too often, which is African history around the year 1750. Remember, the first couple of questions on the exam will revolve around that unit, the world in 1750. Usually it's something about the Tokugawa shogunate, or maybe what was going on in France, or maybe the Ottoman Empire. This is about African kingdoms on the West Coast. Okay, so some things to keep in mind. Let's talk a little bit about Africa in the world in 1750, if you will. So I'll just put Africa in 1750. But Asante is a kingdom on the west coast of Africa, okay? And the kingdoms on the west coast of Africa were the ones that were profiting from the existence of the slave trade, right? Remember that transatlantic slave trade that went from Africa across the Atlantic and to the New World? So maybe let's just put down slave trade. It's something to keep in mind. It was going on still in the world in 1750, okay, the slave trade coming out of Africa. And maybe we should put down how powerful states emerged in West Africa. So let's put that here. Okay, so you might ask yourself, well, how did some states get powerful even though the slave trade was going on? Well, the thing is, what the Europeans tended to do is they did not penetrate the interior of the African continent in 1750. If they wanted a supply of human labor, they would make relationships with kingdoms on the coast, and then those coastal kingdoms would penetrate the interior and engage in human trafficking to bring people to the coast of Africa. So to facilitate this, normally Europeans brought firearms to the West African kingdoms, and those kingdoms that had European firearms tended to get more powerful. And that's what enabled them to do their raids for slaves on the interior of Africa. So maybe we'll put something down about the firearms and the exchange between Europeans and the West Africans. Okay, so a little bit about Africa in 1750. Let's take a look at this source, okay, which is about Asante or Ashanti. That means it's the same thing. The Gold Coast, okay, meaning a coast of Africa that's probably pretty wealthy. And I think this source is going to talk a little bit about that West African kingdom. So let's take a look. Osei Kwadwo clearly believed that Ashanti could not maintain its position solely by force of arms. Okay, meaning it cannot be powerful just because it has weapons. It's got to do more in order to remain a powerful kingdom. During his 13-year reign, he shifted authority in many areas from military leaders to civilian officials. Okay, so this shift in authority from military leaders to civilian officials, that's a reform, right? We're changing the idea that the government should be run by the military to a government being run by civilians. That's a little bit more democratic, right? So that's definitely a change. The Asante devoted great care to the training of these administrators. Many officials entered government departments as children and spent years performing menial, meaning low-level tasks, as they absorbed the routines and attitudes of public service. Okay, so they trained the civilian administrators to be good at running their government. Though most of these youths were the sons of officials, Osei Kwadwo saw to it that opportunities were created for talented outsiders. Okay, so they brought new people in to be government administrators, not just the offspring of those who were already in power, right? So this kind of reflects a society based on merit and not just one based on like nepotism. Trainees who showed ability were promoted, hence that whole merit thing, right? And the most capable eventually attained important posts. Under the guidance of these individuals, Asante entered the 19th century, meaning the 1800s, as the most sophisticated society in all of Africa. Okay, so it's sophisticated for a number of reasons, right? It's obtaining wealth as a result of the slave trade, it's obtaining firearms, and it's using its wealth to create a society in which the government is run by civilian administrators who are receiving adequate training, okay, which is definitely a good thing. So let's take a look at this question. This passage would be best for. So we have to ask ourselves, okay, what can I do with this source? Can I prove any of these things to be true using this document? Our answer is going to be number 1 here, explaining how the Asante king reformed his government. What's the evidence to support it? We have it right here, right? We are changing the way the government is run. It used to be run by the military. Now it's going to be run by civilians. That's a democratic shift or reform. The other answer choices don't make any sense. Recounting strategies used by officers in the Asante military, there's nothing in the source about military strategies. If it's not in the source, I cannot use the source to support number 2. Discussing a variety of childhood experiences within the Asante kingdom, nothing in the source about childhood experiences. Can't pick it. Justifying economic policies implemented under the Asante leadership, there's nothing here about economic policies. Okay, the only thing I have in this source is something about reforms, so I could choose number 1 as my answer. All right, so questions 2 and 3 are based on this political cartoon, which if you take a look, it's from 1789 in Paris, okay? And when I see 1789 and Paris, I'm thinking is a source about the estates system, right? If you remember, you had the first estate, which is the clergy, the second estate is the nobility, and the third estate is basically everybody else. Okay, some of those people tended to have some wealth, right? Maybe they were the bourgeoisie, but the vast majority of the third estate consisted of people who were peasants, basically, who had no money. And if you remember, the third estate faced the unequal tax burden, right? The third estate paid all the French taxes, and the first 2 estates paid 0. So that's kind of what this cartoon is showing us, right? It's showing us this person here who's kind of hunched over with the 2 wealthy estates or social classes on the back of that person, right? This is kind of a burden. This person is struggling to hold up the first 2 estates, right? With, trying to cover them in terms of tax dollars maybe. So which situation is being depicted in this cartoon? The beginning of an estate system where the majority holds power, you might be tempted to put estate system here because that's what this cartoon is showing. But in this system, the majority does not hold power, right? The third estate is the vast majority. The third estate, let's just write this down for a second. Depending on who you talk to, the third estate is like 97 or 98% of French society. That's the majority, and those people have no power, okay? It's also right here. This person who's being hunched over is not a person that's showing power. So we're not going to pick this one, okay? I can see why you would want to, but in the estate system, the majority did not hold power. Creation of a classless society, that's communism, right? This is obviously classes. These 2 individuals are ranked higher than this one. So I don't see anything here about a classless society. Revolution led by the nobility and the clergy. Doesn't look to me like they're leading revolutions. And also think about it. Why would the first 2 estates want to lead a revolution? They are the ones in power. They are prospering from this system that's been going on for hundreds of years. They don't want to change that. So we're going to cross off number 3. Existence of a rigid social class structure is going to be our answer, right? Rigid means unchanging, and it's definitely a social class structure. Okay, so that's going to be our answer for number 2. All right, let's take a look at number 3. Which event directly resulted from the situation shown in this cartoon? The Russian Revolution, that takes place in Russia. Okay, the inequality in France does not contribute to a Russian Revolution. Agricultural Revolution took place in Britain. That's when they invented new technologies to produce more crops in the 1700s. So that the time period is about the same, but this does not cause innovations in farming. So we're going to cross off number 2. French Revolution is our answer. The third estate rose up, declared itself to be the National Assembly, and then took power for themselves, okay, as a result of the inequality. So we will put that as our answer. But the Cultural Revolution, just for the sake of review, this took place in China under Mao Zedong. Okay, he wanted to kind of weed out all traces of non-communist thinking in China in the 1960s. Okay, so that event has nothing to do with inequality in France. So French Revolution is our best answer for number 3. All right, numbers 4 and 5 are based on this source here, The End of Oil, which was published in 2004. Let's take a look at this source and try to figure out what it's all about. What were people using all the extra energy for? More heating and cooking, to be sure, and more travel in steamships and trains. Okay, steamships indicates to me that we're probably talking about the Industrial Revolution. But mainly, people were manufacturing more things. More textiles, right? If you don't remember textiles, that's clothing. More machines, more food and ale, more paper. The pattern was clear. The more you produced, the more energy you needed. Makes sense, right? If we're going to have factories producing textiles powered by steam engines, I'm not going to be able to do that unless I have an abundance of coal. I'm going to need more energy if I'm going to produce more things. And conversely, meaning in reverse, the more energy you used, the more things you produced. And the wealthier you, or more likely your employer or the state became. So the paragraph is making this argument that without an abundance of energy, mass manufacturing is not possible. One might just as well relabel the expanding industrial revolution the energy revolution, because the industrial economies of the 19th century simply could not have developed without the parallel emergence of energy economies to sustain them. So we don't have industrial economies unless we have energy economies. Meaning we're not going to have people mass producing textiles unless we also have a lot of people producing coal or mining coal in order to sustain those factories. And as industrialization spread country by country, region by region, so did demand for energy. So let's take a look at the questions here. Which economic concept best explains the relationship between energy and industrial production discussed in this passage? Okay, our answer is going to be supply and demand here, because since there was a demand for energy sources, it led to new jobs or energy economies to emerge to supply those industries with the necessary energy. Okay, favorable trade balance, that just means when you export more than you import. I'm not seeing any kind of trade balance being reflected in this passage. Collectivization, if you remember, that's how farming took place in communist societies, most notably places like the Soviet Union and communist China under Mao. It's when basically large farms are created and owned by the government, and the peasants live and work there to produce food for the society. That's not something that's being discussed in this source. And scarcity means you don't have enough of something. This source is not making a case that there was like a scarce amount of coal. Right? It just says basically we're producing more coal to meet the needs of the factories. Not, oh, we're running out of coal, so we have a problem now. So since scarcity is not being reflected, we're not going to put that, right? Supply and demand. Since the demand for energy rose, new jobs grew to supply the textile industry with the necessary energy, right? More jobs in like coal mining, for example. Number 5. Which statement best represents this author's point of view, right? Point of view is the author's opinion. Okay, so we have to use the source to try to infer how the author feels about maybe the relationship between energy and industry. Pollution from energy sources hindered the expansion of railways. There's nothing in the source about railways being constructed, and certainly not the hindering of its expansion, right? To hinder something means to slow down or stop. The source says nothing about pollution, so I don't think we can infer a point of view about pollution. So we're going to cross off number 1. New energy technologies reduced industrial production. There's nothing in the source about production going down. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that. Certainly we have new energy technologies. I think they're implying that coal is new here, or the burning of coal, but I'm not seeing anything about reduced industrial production. Okay, so we're going to cross that off. Reliance on traditional energy sources made industrialization more efficient. I would say maybe a traditional energy source would be like animal power or wind or water mills. This source is not talking about those things. Okay? And plus those things are probably less efficient. So we're going to cross off number 3. So that leaves us with number 4. Industrialization was dependent on increased energy production. Okay, you don't have industry without increased energy. That's the main idea of the source. Okay, so I can use the source to infer that this is how the author feels about the relationship between energy and industry. So we're going to put number 4 for question number 5. Those are 2 pretty difficult questions in my opinion. Let's move on to number 6. Okay, numbers 6 and 7 refer to these 2 sources. A lot of reading in this exam. All right, so let's take a look at the sources to try to make sense of what's going on here. Okay, the first source. The influence of laissez-faire on the treatment of Ireland during the famine is impossible to exaggerate. Laissez-faire is an economic idea in which the government does not really get involved with business or society. Almost without exception, the high officials and politicians responsible for Ireland were fervent, meaning strong, believers in non-interference by government, right, which is basically the definition of laissez-faire. And the behavior of the British authorities only becomes explicable, meaning understandable, when their fanatical belief in private enterprise and their suspicions of any action which might be considered government intervention are borne in mind. Right, so this person is basically saying here, as it relates to the Great Hunger, right? So if we're talking about the Great Hunger and Ireland, we're probably talking about the potato famine. This author is trying to make sense of why is it that the government didn't do much to help the Irish? And he's basically saying that it's because the government had a strong belief in laissez-faire and allowing businesses to operate privately without interference, right? So basically they had this mindset that it would be best to not get involved because that would be what's best for society, right? That Adam Smith kind of thinking. So let's take a look at the next source here. What caused the Irish potato famine? So another source about that. Far from allowing the market to work, England launched a massive program of government intervention. That's weird, because this source just said the government did nothing. Now this source is saying the government did massive intervention. These two things are kind of incongruous, right? They don't say the same thing. Okay, so a massive program of government intervention, consisting mainly of building workhouses, most completed just prior to the onset of the famine. Right, so people were put to work building buildings, basically, and that was part of government intervention to try to help out the poor people of Ireland. The workhouses, an early version of New Deal make-work programs, only made the problem of poverty worse. The New Deal, if you don't remember, that took place during the Great Depression in the United States when President Roosevelt put people to work building public works projects to try to ease the problem of poverty during that time period. So the author here is making the case that the English did the same thing for the poor people of Ireland. A system of extensive public works required heavy taxation on the local economy, right? So he's saying that these public works programs had a negative side effect. The English officials directed money away from projects that would increase productivity and agricultural output into useless road building. So the author is claiming here that people were put to work building buildings and roads when they could have been put to work doing something more efficient, right? Maybe like farming. So it was kind of like a waste of human resources, if you will. In addition to the fundamental failure of the government programs, workhouses, public works, and soup kitchens tended to concentrate the people into larger groups and tighter quarters. Tighter quarters means people are living closer together. This allowed the main killer of the famine, disease, to do its evil work. So the person is saying, since people were congregating in order to obtain government services, that made disease spread more quickly. So two interesting sources here. One saying the government didn't do enough. The other saying the government did a bunch of things to try to help, but they did not work out so well. Pretty interesting. So which conclusion about these passages is valid? Our answer is going to be number one here. British officials disagreed about an appropriate response to economic problems. How can we prove that to be true? Well, source one says the way to solve problems is get the government out of people's affairs. This one is saying that the government basically did a bunch of things to try to help. Okay, so there was definitely a disagreement about how to solve this Ireland problem. Non-interference and interference both probably didn't work out so well. Take a look at answer number two, though. Irish peasants refused to accept government assistance during this famine. Well, it says they were put to work building things, and they were obtaining services in places like soup kitchens. Okay, so it doesn't seem to me that they refused to accept government assistance, so we'll cross that off. Agricultural productivity increased as a result of British involvement. Can't pick that one, right? Because the person basically said in source number two here that agricultural output was failing because people were put to work building roads and buildings. So it doesn't look like we have increased agricultural output. If anything, during the potato famine, it decreased, right? So we'll take out number three. Britain's long-term objective was to support Irish nationalism. It's not reflected in either of these sources, right? Nationalism is this idea of having a lot of pride in one's nation. The British are not going to want to encourage Irish pride, because if the Irish people had a lot of pride, they might want to obtain their independence away from Great Britain. And that did not happen just yet. Okay, that didn't happen until after World War I. So there's no way that the British are going to try to encourage that. It doesn't make any sense, and it's not in these sources. So we're going to cross off number 4, and again, our answer to number 6 is choice 1. Number 7, what was a significant consequence of the events described in these passages? Choice 1, a majority of the Irish people converted to Protestant Christianity. It's not a result of the passages. People don't become Protestants because the potatoes went bad. Okay, it just doesn't make any sense. And typically, Irish people tended to be Catholic, like really hardcore Catholic, and that's still the case. So we're going to cross off number 1. Ireland became the most agriculturally diversified country in Europe. Having agricultural diversity means you're growing a lot of different kinds of products. And this is not going to be our answer, because if anything, during the potato famine, one of the major criticisms against the English was they kind of forced the Irish to just simply grow the one thing, right? They were so dependent on the potato, and that's all they really had to eat. If they're just growing and eating potatoes, that's like the opposite of diversification of agriculture. So we're going to cross off number 2. Government intervention no longer took place in Ireland. Can't choose that one, okay? Because government intervention is occurring in source 2. Number 4 is our answer. Approximately 1 million people emigrated from Ireland. Emigrate means to leave. Okay, many of them went to the USA and settled in places like New York and Boston, Massachusetts, okay, as a result of the potato famine. And yes, that would contribute later on to growing Irish nationalism and the demand for independence, okay, but the most immediate consequence is people leaving Ireland and going to other places to escape the famine. So our answer for number 7 is choice 4. Okay, questions 8 and 9 refer to this political cartoon. Let's see if we can kind of analyze this and make some sense of it. Right, so what we have here is Uncle Sam to the powers. Gentlemen, you may cut up this map as much as you like, but remember, I'm here to stay, and you can't divide me up into spheres of influence. Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to assume, and I could pretty solidly infer it based on the outfit of this person, and it's US on the belt here, that this is Uncle Sam, right? Kind of that image of recruitment for the US Army, if you will. And Uncle Sam is holding trade treaty with China. So it looks like the United States is now a trading partner with China. And we have here these European countries. We've got France right here. You can see it on the person's hat. You've got Russia. That's a little easier to see there. This is hard to see here, but we have England on that hat, and we have Italy, pretty easy to see here on this hat. Okay, so what do we see? These European individuals are holding shears, and they're cutting up a map of China, right? So what did the Europeans do? They carved China up into spheres of influence. So let's talk a little bit about what happened to China in the 1800s. So China, if you don't remember, China lost the Opium War, right? The British wanted to find something that the Chinese would be willing to purchase in order for the British to even out their trade imbalance with China. And the only thing the Chinese were interested in purchasing, illegally mind you, it was not legal to purchase this in China, was opium. And the Chinese government tried to clamp down on opium and stop the British from bringing it in, and the British refused. A war was fought over it, the British won, and the British were able to basically get whatever they wanted. Other Europeans would follow suit. So what did the British get? The British got Hong Kong, they got spheres of influence in China, and British citizens won extraterritoriality rights in China, meaning they didn't have to follow Chinese laws, they were only subject to the laws of the British. So I'm just going to go ahead and write a couple of those down here for you now. Okay, so once China lost the Opium War, they're forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing. The British get basically whatever they want. Okay, so this cartoon here is showing the Europeans taking parts of China for themselves, right? China is no longer strong enough to resist the demands of Europeans. And this cartoon refers to something that happened a little bit later, in which the United States said basically, hey, we're going to trade with every part of China, whether Europeans are controlling it or not. That's something called the open door policy, and you'll talk more about that in 11th grade US history. But let's talk about number 8 here. Which development most likely influenced the action taken in this cartoon? Okay, so what's the action taken in the cartoon? It's Europeans and the United States getting trading rights in China and carving it up for themselves. So let's take a look at the answer choices. China's naval power posed a threat to the Western powers. That's definitely not going to be the case, right? Remember, China lost the Opium War. They're no longer a threat, right? They're being carved up. Look at choice 2. China had become stronger militarily than the Western powers. If that was true, the Western powers wouldn't be carving it up. Can't choose that one. The Western powers desired political means to control Japan. Well, this cartoon's not about Japan. It's about China, so I can't use it to prove number 3 to be true. The Western powers desired access to new markets in Asia is our answer. Okay, that's the whole point of a sphere of influence. Okay, if you don't know that, that basically means that a European country can sell its goods in that part of China without competition, meaning like the French would be the exclusive provider of goods in a specific section of China. Same thing with Russia, with England, with Italy. Okay, because it's the Industrial Revolution, right? The Europeans are mass producing products and they need more people to buy their stuff. Otherwise, the items just sit in a warehouse and become worthless. So Europeans are engaging in this second wave of imperialism to make sure that there are people around the world that are going to be purchasing European products, right? Or will be forced to buy European products. Okay, so that's the whole point of this cartoon, is to secure territory where people will be purchasing European products, right? So that motivation for imperialism here, Europeans desired access to new markets. So number 4 is our best answer. Number 9, which concept is depicted in this cartoon? Well, that should be easy now, right? That's imperialism. One part of the world is taking control over another. Socialism is a system in which the government owns and operates all the businesses and other means of production. That's not reflected here. Isolationism is when a country sticks to itself. This is not isolationism, right? This is Europeans going to China. Pacifism means you don't engage in war, right? You're very anti-war. That can't be our answer because all these things result from the Opium War, and the act of Europeans going to a place here and taking over is inherently aggressive. So I would not call that pacifism. Imperialism is the best answer for number 9. Okay, questions 10, 11, and 12 refer to this cartoon showing some countries and the word nationalism and some associated symbolism. This cartoon has been on the Regents a couple of times in the last 10, 12, 15 years, and here it is again in June of 2023. So before we go any further, maybe we talk a little bit about nationalism and some of the effects of nationalism. So I'm going to go ahead and make some notes about nationalism down here, and I would encourage you to do the same thing. So let's start with a basic definition of nationalism. Okay, nationalism can be defined as pride in one's country or group above all others. Okay, one thing to keep in mind is that sometimes people use the term nation and country interchangeably, but a nation does not have to be a country. A nation could just be a group of people that share certain characteristics. Maybe they share a common language, a common, belief system, a common history. So if you're nationalistic, you're going to put the needs of your own people above the needs of a different group of people, right? And if we're going to use the word as a country, I'm going to put the needs of my country above the needs of someone else's country. And this has some inherent effects. So let's talk about some effects of this nationalistic attitude. Okay, if I'm nationalistic, I might have a desire for my group to have a strong and independent country for itself. So one way we could express that is the term nation state. My nation or my group has its own country, and I want that country to be strong and independent. What else? I might have, if I'm nationalistic, maybe a feeling of superiority to other groups or nations. So let's write that down too. Maybe think about something like Nazi Germany as an example of this, right? That's extreme nationalism, but the Nazis, right, this Aryan group, if you will, felt superior to all other groups living in Europe, right? And those kinds of attitudes helped usher in World War II and the Holocaust. Let's see, what else? Maybe intolerance of minority groups could be an effect of nationalism, right? If I think my group is the best, I'm not really going to have a lot of positive feelings about other groups living in my territory. So let's go ahead and write that down as well. Okay, maybe nationalism leads to the intolerance of minority groups who may be seen as a threat to the goals of the nation. So what else about nationalism? How about unification? So unification of people who have a similar background, right? So if people that are nationalistic want to have a strong and independent country, it makes sense to encourage unification, because if people are working together, that'll mean that that group is now stronger, right? Maybe their military is stronger. They're all paying taxes to one government. So that country should have more money coming in and therefore more strength. So typically people who are nationalistic push for the unification of people who are similar in terms of, again, language, religion, background, etc. All right, how about one more? How about nationalism might not just unify people, maybe it divides people up. Maybe it divides empires up if the empire contains multiple nations living within it who see themselves as being different from each other. Let's go ahead and write that down here. Breakup of empires that contain many different nations. Sometimes this might be expressed as not just different nations or ethnic groups. That kind of means the same thing. An ethnic group is a group of people with a common, perhaps language or common history, common culture. Okay, it's another way of saying nation. So all these are effects of that nationalistic attitude. And two of these are reflected in this cartoon, right? So if you take a look at map A here, Austria, or the Austria-Hungary Empire, contained all these places. And it looks here like nationalism is leading to some kind of explosion and these places being kind of blown apart, right? Because they were once all connected and now nationalism is causing them to be separated, right? Perhaps the Italians, who saw themselves as being a different nation from the Austrians, wanted to be strong and independent, and therefore were not tolerant of being controlled by the Austrians. So maybe that led to an independence movement and therefore splitting off from the rest of the empire, right? That this is showing an effect of nationalism. Take a look at this one, right? Nationalism here is written over this object here. And this is tough because I'm not sure everyone knows what this is representing, but this is a magnet. And it's showing that this magnet is bringing these particular places in Germany together. This is showing us the unification impact of nationalism, right? So you might remember a certain individual named Otto von Bismarck encouraged the unification of all German-speaking peoples inside of Western Europe. Okay, so with the encouragement of nationalism, people saw themselves as being part of one major group, therefore joined the territories together to create one united, stronger Germany, as opposed to being separated into separate states as they were before Otto von Bismarck. Okay, so the magnet of nationalism can unify people if the people exhibit similar cultural traits or backgrounds, as they did in Germany in the middle of the 1800s. So let's take a look at these questions. One reason for the situation shown in map A was Austria's defeat by Germany in both world wars. Can't be our answer, because if you remember, Germany and Austria were allies in both world wars. So we're going to cross off number one. Diverse ethnic composition is our answer. Okay, map A shows many different ethnic groups, aka many different nations. Okay, so if it's many different nations or many different ethnicities, that's diversity. Okay, so when an empire has a lot of cultural diversity, sometimes that empire does not hold together because all the different cultures, aka nations or ethnic groups, want independence for themselves. So we certainly see ethnic diversity in map A, but let's look at choices 3 and 4. Loss of power after fighting the Ottoman Empire. That doesn't make any sense because, again, in World War I, the Ottomans and the Austrians were allies. Location along key trade routes. It doesn't show me anything about trade routes in that map, so I'm not going to go ahead and pick choice 4. Number 2 is our best answer, right? Many different cultural, national, ethnic groups, whatever you want to call them, are reflected in map A. Number 11, what led to the situation shown in map B? So what led to nationalism bringing German-speaking peoples together? Let's take a look. Choice 1, Prussian leaders appealing to a common German culture in wars against common enemies. That's our answer. Okay, so let's write down that name for a second. Otto von Bismarck, who was a Prussian guy. Okay, Prussia is a place that doesn't exist anymore, but if you lived in Prussia in the middle of the 1800s, you spoke German and you had a German culture. Okay, so the people of Prussia were thinking, how can we make ourselves stronger? Let's unite with the rest of the German-speaking peoples, and then we'll have a stronger whole Germany. Okay, so Bismarck proposed here that he would use blood and iron to accomplish that goal. Right? That was one of his speeches. He said it wasn't going to be through liberal means, meaning democratic means, but by warfare that the German people will be united together. Right? Because maybe the people of Saxony, despite having a similar cultural background to the Prussians, maybe they were happy being independent. So Otto von Bismarck of Prussia said, well, you can't see it now, but this is better for you if you're joined together with us. So that is going to be our number one. Right, so Otto von Bismarck appealed to a common German culture, saying, hey, you guys are German, you should be part of us. You should be part of a united Germany. And since he's the blood and iron guy, he went to wars against his enemies in order to accomplish these goals. What are those wars? Maybe you remember hearing about the Franco-Prussian War or the Austro-Prussian War. Let me just go ahead and write those down for you. Okay, so Bismarck had to go to war against both France and Austria in order to free German-speaking territories from the control of one of those places. Okay, once he was able to do that, those territories would become part of a united, stronger Germany. Otto von Bismarck actually used the term Reich, just like Hitler did. He called this the Second German Reich. Hitler called his Germany the Third Reich. Right, so a German empire consisting of German-speaking people. Let's look at the other answer choices. A president elected by male voters in German states. That did not lead to this, right? Because this did not occur through democratic or liberal, as Bismarck put it, means. It occurred by warfare. So we're going to cross off number 2. Approval of German princes at a conference in Potsdam. Same thing, right? Approval implies democracy, and Bismarck did not achieve this with democracy. He did it through warfare. Number 4, proclamation of the Empress who was head of the German Confederation. German Confederation was something that Napoleon came up with when he was marching through Europe. Okay, and that was gone by 1815. Okay, so this was before what happened here, and it was not a long-lasting union. Once the Congress of Vienna took place in 1815, the German Confederation was gone, and again, you were left with separate German states. So someone else was going to have to step in to unite the German people. So our best answer for number 11 is choice 1. And this is very difficult, right? Because you had to remember Bismarck, you had to remember he was Prussian, you had to remember that he used blood and iron to achieve his goals, which means warfare. So all those things go into knowing that number 1 is the answer. Number 12. Which claim about nationalism is best supported by maps A and B? Nationalism only occurs in Western European countries. Yes, it's showing me Western Europe, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not occurring somewhere else. So I can't choose number 1. And we should know that nationalism occurred in other places, right? Nationalism occurred in Turkey, right? The Turks were trying to rebuild and reshape the Ottoman Empire to make it stronger. Nationalism occurred in Japan during the Meiji Restoration. Nationalism occurred in South America while Simón Bolívar was trying to make it independent. Okay, so I'm going to cross off number 1. Nationalism has not been found to lead to military conflicts. I certainly cannot cross that off. Okay, because this was created through military conflict, and this is showing military conflict, right? The Italians, the Austrians, the Czechs, the Hungarians are fighting with each other to obtain independence as a result of nationalistic attitudes. So I'm going to cross off number 2. Number 3, nationalism is both a unifying and dividing force. We can choose that. Why? The magnet is unifying people, and the explosion is dividing. There's your evidence to support choice 3. But let's look at number 4. Nationalism has played a limited role in the political makeup of European countries. That could not be further from the truth. A lot of countries would not even exist if they didn't have nationalistic attitudes, right? Think about a place like India. Gandhi had a lot of nationalistic attitudes. He wanted to see India be strong and independent. If the Indian people did not have that attitude, maybe India is still part of the British Empire, right? So nationalism has a major role in the political makeup of European countries and maybe countries around the world. So certainly number 4 is not going to be our answer. Number 3, is the best bet, since there's evidence in the pictures to support it. Okay, questions 13, 14, and 15 refers to the source from Mahatma Gandhi from May 4th, 1930. So let's take a look at the source together. This passage is from Gandhi's second letter to Lord Irwin, drafted on the eve of his arrest. So the day before Gandhi got arrested, he wrote this. Dear friend, God willing, it is my intention to set out for Dharasana and reach there with my companions and demand possession of the salt works. So Gandhi is going to the salt factory. This happened just after the Salt March. Maybe you learned about that when Gandhi was protesting British taxes involving salt. Gandhi's like, well, why should we buy British salt and pay their taxes? Let's just go collect water from the Indian Ocean and let it evaporate and it'll turn to sea salt. Okay, so this happened right after the fact. So Gandhi wanted to take over the British salt factory. The public have been told that Dharasana is a private property. This is mere camouflage. It is as effectively under government control as the Viceroy's house. So the factory is under government control, just like the place where the Viceroy lives is government control, right? The Viceroy is like the British King's representative or Queen's representative inside of India. Not a pinch of salt can be removed without the previous sanction of the authorities. So the Indian people cannot get salt unless it comes from British authorities. It is possible for you to prevent this raid, as it has been playfully and mischievously called, in 3 ways. By removing the salt tax, so Gandhi won't try to raid the salt factory if the British just get rid of the salt tax. Makes sense. By arresting me and my party. So if you arrest Gandhi beforehand, he won't be raiding the British factory. Makes sense. Or by sheer violence, unless every head broken is replaced, as I hope it will. Right, so Gandhi's basically saying here, you could stop me if you just get rid of the tax, or if you arrest me, or if you take us down with violence, okay? But the violence isn't going to work if every broken head is replaced by somebody, and Gandhi hopes that it will. Right? Whoever has been hurt, simply someone else will step up to take their place. Okay, so this letter was primarily written in response to what? Right, so basically the question is asking which of these things is a historical circumstance for Gandhi issuing this letter to the British representative. Partition of India and Pakistan cannot be our answer, because that happened after the fact, right? That happened in 1947. Question is asking about what caused the letter. This is going to happen later on. Widespread boycott of British textiles. Gandhi did that. The widespread boycott of British textiles was occurring around the same time period, right? This is about salt, not about textiles. Choice 3 here is not going to be correct. Human rights violations at Amritsar. Let's do some backstory on that. Okay, so in 1919, a law was passed basically allowing the British to arrest people without a fair trial or without reason. So there was a protest against it, and some British soldiers shot and injured or killed Indian protesters. Okay, so people were upset about that, and it did lead to, maybe some nationalism and a desire for Indian independence, but that does not directly cause the salt situation. Okay, the salt letter here was a protest against the salt taxes. Okay, not a protest against the Rowlatt Act. So I'm not going to pick choice 3. Tough though, but choice 4 is our answer. British monopoly of Indian resources. Why is that the answer? Because the British are monopolizing salt, right? Gandhi said no one can get salt unless it comes from the government, the British government. That is a monopoly. So Gandhi is trying to break that monopoly by trying to get salt for himself, okay? So number 4 is our answer. Number 14, the purpose of Gandhi's letter was to. So why did Gandhi write this? Number 1 is going to be our answer here. Notify the British government of his plan to continue his nationalist efforts, right? He's got a lot of pride in being Indian. He wants India to be strong, and India cannot be strong if it has to pay taxes to the British, right? The Indians would probably like it if their tax dollars stayed in their own country. So this is definitely an act of nationalism and an act to try to get the British out of India. But let's look at the other answer choices. Inform the British Viceroy that his home is considered private property. He doesn't say anything about his own home. He says that the Viceroy's home is private property. This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's kind of like an opposite answer choice. Advocate for British control over salt production. Why would Gandhi want the British to have control over the salt? He's protesting against British control over Indian salt. That doesn't make any sense. Explain how religion has influenced his fight for independence against Britain. Definitely not, right? He doesn't mention anything about religion and how religion is motivating him, right? He's motivated to end the salt tax. That's his primary goal here. So number 4, we're going to cross that out, right? His purpose here is to tell the British that he wants India to be stronger. He wants the British out, right? That's a nationalistic attitude. So number 1 is going to be our answer. Number 15, which other document presented a message similar to this letter? This is a really hard question because I think students, when they saw this, they might have recognized the individual or the country, but maybe not the laws or the speech. So let's talk about them a little bit, right? Nelson Mandela should be a person that you know of. Let's make some Mandela notes down here, right? Mandela equals anti-apartheid in South Africa. Okay, so Nelson Mandela worked to end social injustice in South Africa, and his speech, even if you didn't know the speech, you could probably kind of infer that this is going to be the answer, right? Because Gandhi was a social justice warrior, right? He wanted more rights and freedoms for the majority, right? The Indian people were the majority. Mandela wanted more rights and freedoms for the Black South African majority. So that is our answer. But if you knew a little bit about his speech, it would make even more sense. So the Rivonia trial speech, so Mandela was arrested and he was put in jail for, I want to say, about 30 years for his anti-government activities. So at his trial, he's quoted as saying, "I am prepared to die." And when he said that, he was referring to he would die to achieve his goals. Just like Gandhi in this quote here is saying he would subject himself willingly to violence in order to achieve his goal of Indian independence and getting rid of that salt tax. Okay, so that is definitely going to be our answer here. Let's look at the other answer choices though, right? Germany's Nuremberg laws? Certainly not. These are laws that are discriminatory against Jewish people. That is not similar to what we see here. Mao's Little Red Book is not the answer. This contained quotations of Mao Zedong that was published in, I want to say, the 1960s in China, and they contained a lot of communist ideas. This is not about communism, so we're going to cross that out. France's law of suspects, that's tough, okay, because maybe law of suspects is not something you can recognize, and there's nothing here about an individual, so you might ask yourself, well, what period in French history are we talking about? Think about your curriculum, right? The time you talked about France the most was during the French Revolution unit of your studies, right? Suspects means people that might be considered treacherous. So think about maybe the French Revolution. Was there a time period in which people were suspected of being anti-change? Yeah, that's the Reign of Terror, right? So during the Reign of Terror, people's rights and freedoms were being taken away. So Mandela's speech in which he basically said he's willing to die for his cause is similar to Gandhi saying he's okay with being subjected to violence, right? They're both examples of civil disobedience. Maybe we write that term down, right? Civil disobedience is another way of saying nonviolent protest, okay? None of these other things are similar to what Gandhi is doing here. Only Mandela makes sense. Let's keep going. Okay, questions 16 and 17 refer to these 3 quotes. Stalin solidifies power for communists. Adolf Hitler declares Third Reich. Mussolini establishes fascist state. Which situation was most responsible for the rise of the political systems referred to in these headlines? Unification of Italy is not responsible for Stalin becoming the leader of the Soviet Union. So I'm going to cross that out. Doesn't make any sense. Conflicts between European nations over Africa, that certainly happened, but that has nothing to do with Stalin. Okay, the Soviet Union did not participate in this. So since Stalin is not reflected here, we're going to cross off number 2. Worldwide economic instability is our answer. We'll talk about it in a second. Emergence of the US as a world power. The US emerging as a world power has nothing to do with Stalin getting more powerful. It has nothing to do with Hitler declaring the Third Reich. Those 2 things do not go together. But number 3 is something that caused all these things to happen. So we have to think about a general time period here that kind of fits all three of these individuals. And this is the 1920s to 1930s. Well, what was going on in the world in the 1920s and the 1930s? World War I is over. World War II didn't happen yet. What happened in the middle? During a lot of these years, it wasn't such a good time for countries in Western Europe. Even in 1929, things weren't looking so good for the United States, right? So maybe we refine this. Maybe we say late 1920s to 1930s. This is the Great Depression time period, right? So let's put that down. Great Depression, let's say 1929 to 1939. One could argue that it's over once World War II starts, and World War II started right here in 1939. And one thing to keep in mind is that during the Great Depression, things were really bad for people, especially in a place like Germany, right? After World War I, Germany is forced to pay reparations. They owed a lot of money, therefore, to the British and to the French. Their economy was in ruins. They couldn't even create jobs for themselves in the armed forces because their armed forces were drastically reduced as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So when people are really, really desperate, that's when they turn to radical ideas. People accepted communism in Russia because communism promises to give things to people when they have nothing, right? Remember Vladimir Lenin, peace, land, and bread? Well, Stalin, he's the successor to Vladimir Lenin, right? So people accepted communism when they were desperate. People accepted Hitler and Mussolini's fascism, right? This hyper-nationalistic attitude when they were desperate, right? Because Hitler promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. He promised to put German people back to work, right? Even if his ideas were a little bit radical and maybe, anti-Semitic and scary, the vast majority of Germans accepted it because they were desperate, right? So that economic instability, that lack of jobs caused the desperation that led to these individuals obtaining power. That's why number 3 is our best answer for this question. Number 17, what is a common characteristic of the political systems represented in these headlines? Multinationalism is the idea of basically an empire containing multiple nations and maybe having some degree of tolerance and acceptance and holding the empire together. Hitler was not like that, right? Hitler wanted Germany for German people only. He wanted other nations out of Germany, right? And he did some horrible things to try to make that happen. So I'm going to cross off number 1. Capitalism doesn't make any sense. Okay, capitalism is the idea that the government does not really get involved in the businesses and you are allowed to own private property. Communism is the opposite of capitalism. Okay, so this capitalism is not a common characteristic because communism is here. Humanitarianism is the idea that government should be there to help all people and do nice things for people. I wouldn't say that Hitler did nice things for everybody, and I wouldn't say Stalin did nice things for everybody, right? Maybe you remember Stalin's forced famine in the Ukraine. I would not call that an act of humanitarianism. So our answer here is totalitarianism. Maybe we should define totalitarianism, right? Totalitarianism is when the government has complete control over every aspect in society. Let's write that down. Both Stalin and Hitler tried to control everything, right? Maybe they controlled what's on TV, what's on the radio, what religion, if any, you're allowed to have, right? Mussolini, very similar. So this is a common characteristic in all three. Fascism and communism are inherently totalitarianism. You could also lump maybe President Xi Jinping in China into this as well, even though he's way later. Actually, he's current. All three of these people and countries share this in common. So number 4, totalitarianism, is our answer for number 17. Okay, number 18 is based on this picture here, and this was tricky for a lot of kids on this exam. Okay, you have to understand some symbolism and you have to understand the place and the time period in order to get this right. Okay, so first of all, we see this swastika kind of crushing Poland in 1939, right? So if you see the swastika, you should understand that this represents Nazi Germany, okay? And the Germans invaded Poland in 1939. So which term is most closely associated with the event shown in the cartoon? It's not going to be disarmament. Disarmament means you're getting rid of weapons. You cannot have disarmament if you're going to war. 3, Holodomor, is when Joseph Stalin committed an act of forced famine against the Ukrainians. So this has nothing to do with Ukraine and Stalin, so we're going to cross that off. Containment is when the Western European nations tried to stop the spread of communism. That is not something shown in this cartoon. right? So we're going to cross that off. Our answer is blitzkrieg. Hopefully you could have gotten that based on process of elimination, which you should always be doing. But blitzkrieg is like a German word for lightning war, where the Germans try to overwhelm an enemy really quickly with planes, tanks, fast-moving troops, like the opposite of trench warfare. And that's the tactic that the Germans used on Poland. It's what they tried to use against the British and also against the Soviet Union. Okay, so blitzkrieg is what the Nazis did in Poland in September of 1939. That is going to be our answer to number 18. Okay, question 19 is based on this picture here. It says down barriers in Germany, and it was published in, it looks like maybe a newspaper, in 1946. Okay, so ask yourself, what was going on with Germany in 1946? Well, World War II is over. What's the next world event that happens after World War II? This is the Cold War time, right? And that should help us with our answer choice, but let's talk about this picture and try to understand what's going on here. I see here USSR zone, USA zone, British zone, and it looks like in the USSR zone, meaning Soviet Union, the person has a quote here. Looks very like cooperation to me, most suspicious. But it's Germany, right? So you have to understand the context here. After World War II, Germany is divided into occupied zones, right? And I'll show a map of this in a second so you can get a better sense of this. But there was an American occupied zone, a French occupied zone, a British occupied zone, and a Soviet occupied zone. And not too long after World War II is over, the countries in the West, the US, the British, and the French, dismantled the barriers between them and formed one united West Germany, right? Unification means strength. And if we're going to contain the spread of communism, it's important if we're all working together. So instead of separate zones, it would just be one united Western Germany. And it looks like the person on the USSR side is a little bit nervous about that because now there's a stronger united West Germany right on their border. Okay, so the barriers are coming down in West Germany and the Soviet Union is not happy about it. So the question, the situation shown in this cartoon is most closely associated with what? Obviously it's the Cold War. The Holocaust had already happened, right? That's during World War II. 1946, World War II is already over. Rise of fascism happens in the 1920s, okay? Long before, just like the Holocaust, long before. End of World War I, long before. That's 1918. Okay, so the Cold War is what's being reflected here. The separate occupied zones of West Germany uniting into one, and the two sides opposed to each other. How do I know that they're opposed to each other? There's barbed wire in between them. That's all Cold War stuff. So answer choice 4 for question number 19. Let's keep going. Okay, question number 20 is based on this passage from Jawaharlal Nehru in 1955. Let's take a look and try to make some sense of it. This is an excerpt from a speech given at the conclusion of the Asian African Conference in Bandung, Indonesia. Indonesia, if you don't know, is in Southeast Asia. And 1955 is during the Cold War times. We value the friendship of the great countries. And if I may, on your part, I should like to say that we send our greetings to the great countries of Europe and America, probably referring to the US and the Soviet Union, right? It is not in any spirit of hatred or dislike or aggressiveness we meet here with regard to Europe or America. Certainly not. We send our greetings to them, I hope from all of us here, and we want to be friends with them and to cooperate with them. But we shall only cooperate in the future, and we shall obviously only be friends and equals. There is no friendship when nations are not equal. So basically saying India would be happy. If you didn't know, Nehru is a prime minister, the first prime minister of India after independence. He's saying India is happy to be friends with the US or the Soviet Union as long as India is treated equally, right? Not as simply like the pawn of one of those superpowers. So again, there is no friendship when nations are not equal, and they're not equal when one has to obey another and when one only dominates another. That is why we raise our voices against the domination. So raise our voices against the domination and colonialism from which many of us have suffered for so long. And that is why we have to be very careful that any form of domination does not come our way. Therefore, we want to be friends with the West and friends with the East and friends with everybody. Because if there is something that may be called the approach to the mind and spirit of Asia, It is one of toleration and friendship and cooperation, not one of aggressiveness. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind here, Nehru, and it's in the source as well, he's a proponent of something called the Non-Alignment Movement. Let me just write that down for you for a second. And the Non-Alignment Movement means countries that were newly independent after World War II. This Nehru guy is basically saying it's probably best if you don't get caught up in the alliances of either the Soviet Union or the United States, because you don't want to commit yourself to a military effort when you're a weak, newly independent country. You should focus on yourself first, make sure your needs are being met, and then you can participate in some kind of global alliance, right? So look out for yourself first, make sure you're strong and equal in power to the other countries so that you won't be dominated by somebody else. So Nehru's views in this passage can best be described as what? Certainly not imperialist, right? He's not arguing that India should go out and conquer other places, right? He's arguing that India should just be equal to everybody else and that one country should not be dominated by another. Militarist? He's not saying India needs to be militaristic, right? Militaristic means glorifying the power of the military. He's not arguing for that in the source. Communist? Definitely not, right? He's not saying in the source that the government should go and take control over all the businesses and make all the economic decisions. It's not here. What is here is nationalism. How do we know that? Right? He's basically saying that India needs to be strong and raise its voice against domination from other people, right? It doesn't want to go back to being dominated by the British. It wants to be strong and able to resist colonialism, meaning imperialism, right? So that idea of strength for the nation is nationalism. That's a very, very hard question. But again, use process of elimination. If it's not in the source, you can't pick it, right? And I think it's really clear to see that 1, 2, and 4 are not in this source. So go with what's left, right? Choice 3 is the answer. Okay, questions 21 and 22 come from a source by Kwame Nkrumah from 1963. Let's take a look at the source. On this continent, it has not taken us long to discover that the struggle against colonialism does not end with the attainment of national independence. So just because we're independent now doesn't mean that our struggle is over. Independence is only the prelude, meaning the beginning of, a new and more involved struggle for the right to conduct our own economic and social affairs, to construct our society according to our aspirations, unhampered by crushing and humiliating neo-colonialist controls and interference. Neo-colonialist means like new colonialism, meaning new imperialism. So he's basically saying here that independence is just the beginning in terms of the quest to make sure that our country is strong enough to resist interference from foreign countries. We have to do more to try to make sure that no one's interfering in our affairs. From the start, we have been threatened with frustration where rapid change is imperative, and with instability where sustained effort and ordered rule are indispensable. So people in Africa are frustrated, things are unstable, no sporadic act nor pious resolution can resolve our present problems. Nothing will be of avail except the united act of a united Africa. So he's saying individual countries in Africa cannot simply pass a law to fix all their problems. The only solution to the problems of Africa, according to Nkrumah, is the creation of a united Africa. You've probably heard of this before. This is something called Pan-Africanism, and it's a nationalist idea, right? Kwame Nkrumah says basically, hey, we all have a common past, right? We were all colonies, so let's come together and make ourselves one united Africa so we will be strong enough to resist new efforts at colonization in Africa. Let's keep going. We have already reached the stage where we must unite or sink into that condition which has made Latin America the unwilling and distressed prey of imperialism after 1.5 centuries of political independence. He's basically saying that countries in Latin America, even though they're independent now, are still weak and still falling victim to the desires of foreign countries, even though they're independent. So he's saying we have to unite in Africa, otherwise Africans will suffer the same fate as Latin Americans. Interesting. The ideas expressed in this passage are most similar to the ideas of whom? It's going to be number 1, Simón Bolívar. Why? Because he argued for the unification of South America. Okay, this is a person that fought for independence in South America from the rule of the Spanish and Portuguese. And when he achieved that, he thought the only way we're going to be strong and able to resist future threats is to come together. It never happened. There were too many local interests that got in the way of that. But that's what he wanted. Churchill was the Prime Minister of Britain, who got Britain through World War II and the early Cold War period. Deng Xiaoping is associated with economic reform in China, right? He brought in a little capitalism, right? So that got the Chinese economy going. He's also a person associated with the Tiananmen Square massacre and the one-child policy. None of those things are similar to what we see in this source. And Mary Wollstonecraft is an Enlightenment philosopher, basically arguing for equal treatment of men and women, and that women should also have the right to a public education. Great ideas, but again, not reflected here. Simón Bolívar is similar because he wanted the same thing as Nkrumah. So number 1 for question 21. 22. Based on this passage, which statement best supports Kwame Nkrumah's point of view? So how does Nkrumah feel based on the information here? Let's try to make an inference. Nations in Africa must be careful to avoid being conquered by Latin America. He's not saying that at all, right? He doesn't think Latin America is a threat. He thinks Latin America is weak because the people did not unite. So we're going to cross off choice 1. Now that nations in Africa have gained independence, their struggle is over. He doesn't say that, right? He doesn't feel that way. He thinks independence is just the beginning, right? Prelude means beginning. So certainly he doesn't think the struggle is over. African nations must unite to protect themselves from neo-colonialists. Yeah, that's the answer, right? Because he says that exact thing in the source. We must unite to prevent ourselves from being humiliated by neo-colonialists, meaning new threats of imperialism. Number 4 is not going to be our answer. African nations were better off as colonies. No way is he ever going to say that. Okay, so number 3, unification, is what he's arguing for. Okay, questions 23 and 24 are based on the sources that appear on the previous page. So document A is an excerpt from opening statement by State President F.W. de Klerk. And this took place in 1991. So F.W. de Klerk, if you don't know, was the last white president of South Africa. And he, along with some other key individuals, fought to end apartheid and open up the democratic process to all South Africans, no matter what race. And then Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa. So let's take a look at document A, which comes from de Klerk. To achieve a win-win result, probably making both races happy in South Africa, so to achieve a win-win result will require us to face reality. Apparently, conflicting demands will have to be reconciled with one another sensibly, conflicting demands such as protection of the established economic interests of investors, landowners, and businessmen, professional people and salaried workers against the demand for better living conditions on the part of the less privileged. Okay, so if we're going to make everybody happy, the people who are in business in South Africa are going to want to be protected, even though a lot of people want to take from the business people, the people who were not doing so well under apartheid. Participation by and protection of minorities from domination against the demand of a majority. So we're going to have to protect the white minorities once the black majority is in power, right? Otherwise, not everyone in South Africa is going to be happy. Recognition and accommodation of our diversity of population. So recognize that the country has multiple groups living within it and that they don't have a common loyalty, right? So we have to understand that different groups of people are going to have different needs and we have to accept that. The need for education linked to language and culture against the necessity of a single education system, right? So education should vary according to the culture and the needs of each group living in South Africa. A one-size-fits-all approach to education will not work here, according to F.W. de Klerk. So I could continue. The heart of the challenge lies in all of us having to learn not to propagate only the truth that fits our case, but also in being able to see and understand the truth that may not suit our case. So we have to understand that we have to recognize the needs of all people in South Africa the best we can, right? We have to come to compromises. We have to try to make everybody at least a little bit happy. Otherwise, the country's going to fall apart into maybe even chaos and civil war. And then together, working out a solution that recognizes the whole truth and deals with it sensibly, right? So a solution that makes everybody at least a little bit happy. And in document B, we have two individuals, Mandela and de Klerk, receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993. Why did they get these awards? Because they contributed to the end of apartheid. And in 1994, an election was held and Mandela became the first black president of South Africa. So let's look at the questions now. Based on these documents, which method is being used by Mandela and de Klerk to address the conflict in South Africa? This is tough, okay? But outside military intervention, nowhere does he say we need foreign countries to come in with their military to kind of keep the peace between the two races. So we're going to cross off number 1. 2, political compromise. That might be our answer, right? Because he's saying we have to understand the needs of all the different groups. Violent revolution? No, he doesn't want that. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say that black South Africans need to have a violent revolution against the white minority. He's saying we have to find ways to come together and recognize each other's needs. So we're going to cross off number 3. This is tough because a lot of students would pick this because they know that sanctions were put on South Africa to end apartheid. But it's not the solution that he says in the source, right? The question is asking based on the documents. So make sure you understand that when it's saying based on the documents, you're answering based on the documents. Don't pick something you know is right if it wants you to basically use your reading comprehension skills. Okay, so yes, sanctions did contribute to the end of apartheid, but political compromise is the strategy that de Klerk is suggesting for South Africa. Okay, so we're going to pick number 2 for number 23. So, 24. As shown in document B, Mandela and de Klerk are being honored for agreeing to establish a political system that, provided universal suffrage, is going to be our answer. Okay, so if you don't know what universal suffrage means, suffrage is the right to vote. Let's put that down. And when apartheid is ended, that means all South Africans are going to have that right. Okay, both white and black. Right? So if apartheid is gone, which is what those people did to earn their award, everyone's going to get the right to vote. So number 1 is our answer. They're not going to argue for the complete separation of the races, right? That's the exact opposite thing that they were trying to accomplish. Allowed only a single political party? Certainly not, right? There were political parties that represented the interests of each race in South Africa, and de Klerk and Mandela are not going to argue that only one will be legal. Nationalized all the major industries? That's not what they did, okay? The government of South Africa did not go around and take over all the businesses, right? And de Klerk actually says here that we have to protect the interests of the business owners, right? Protecting the business owners kind of runs contrary to the government taking over their businesses, if that makes any sense. So we're going to cross off choice 4. What did they do? They ended apartheid, and therefore everyone had the right to vote. And then they picked Nelson Mandela to be the first black president of South Africa. That was kind of a tough question, I would say. All right, so that's number 24. Let's move on to 25. And question 25 comes from a source written by Catherine O'Donnell. New study quantifies use of social media in Arab Spring 2011. Okay, so a little over 10 years ago. The Arab Spring was a time period in which a lot of countries in the Middle East were having revolutions against dictatorships and trying to replace those dictatorships with more democratic governments. And the success to which they achieved those goals is a little unclear. In some cases, countries did become more democratic. In some other cases, the military just rose to power and replaced one bad dictatorship with another. But nevertheless, it was an effort to end old governments with old dictators. And social media played a major role in accomplishing that. Social media could be services like Facebook, Twitter, blogs. If it's 2011, maybe there were some other services around as well. But basically, people communicate with each other online to coordinate rebellions against oppressive governments in the Middle East. So let's look at the source and try to make some sense of it. Political discussion in blogs, it's like websites where you record your own ideas, indicated the turn of popular opinion in both Tunisia and Egypt. In Tunisia, conversations about liberty, democracy, and revolution on blogs and on Twitter often immediately preceded mass protests. So basically people were talking to each other online about rights, and then boom, mass protests happened right after. 20% of blogs were evaluating Ben Ali's leadership the day he resigned from office, up from just 5% the month before. So a lot of people were talking about maybe the bad government on social media just before the guy quit, right? So maybe that played a role in the guy quitting. Subsequently, the primary topic for Tunisian blogs was revolution, until a public rally of at least 100,000 people eventually forced the old regime's remaining leaders to relinquish power. So social media was talking about the ineffective government in Tunisia, and then that led to 100,000 people demonstrating and the government giving up, aka relinquishing their power. In the case of both Tunisia's and Egypt's revolutions, discussions spanned borders. In the 2 weeks after Mubarak's resignation, he was the president of Egypt, there was an average of 2,400 tweets a day from people in neighboring countries about the political situation in Egypt. In Tunisia, after Ben Ali's resignation, there were about 2,200 tweets a day. Okay, so political discussions were taking place on social media about many different countries. I might be in Egypt, but I'm talking about on social media the situation in Tunisia, right? So social media is not restricted by political boundaries as maybe like traditional media might be, like a newspaper delivery service. Okay, so that basically means that even more people can hear the ideas about how the governments in these places are bad. And that should lead to more uprisings and revolutions. In other words, Howard, who was a professor of communications, Howard said that people throughout the region were drawn into an extended conversation about social uprising. The success of demands for political change in Egypt and Tunisia led individuals in other countries to pick up the conversation. It helped create discussion across the region. So when people heard using social media that revolution was successful in one place, that might encourage revolution to quickly happen somewhere else. Okay? So social media played a huge role in the Arab Spring. What was the Arab Spring? Countries in the Middle East had a bunch of protest movements to get rid of old, ineffective, repressive dictatorships. 25. Which statement about the use of social media is best supported by the passage? The use of Twitter had little impact on uprisings? No, right? The source makes the case for the exact opposite, that Twitter had a huge impact. Online discussions about political rights helped encourage mass demonstrations? Yeah, that's going to be your answer, right? He basically says that basically people coordinated their protests using social media. So we're going to pick choice 2. But number 3, Egyptian and Tunisian governments were successful in limiting social media access. Certainly not, right? Their governments fell. So if the governments fell, they were not successful at stopping access to Twitter. Leaders were able to use propaganda on social media to limit political reforms. That is not the case here, okay? If that happened, the governments in Tunisia and Egypt would not have gone away. You have this happening a little bit now, right? Perhaps maybe the modern Chinese government is using technology to kind of push propaganda on people to, stop their demands for reforms, but that was not the case in 2011 in the Middle East, right? The best answer here is number 2, right? Because it's supported by the passage. The passage does not support number 4. Number 2 is our answer. 26. How is social media use most likely to affect places with political conditions like those described in the passage? Choice 1. Repressive governments will have more difficulty maintaining power. That's our answer, right? So countries around the world that have bad conditions are going to have a hard time maintaining power because people will be using social media to try to coordinate revolutions and take those governments down. Okay? So it's going to be hard to stay in power in countries that are kind of teetering on revolution because of social media. Choice 2 says, liberal democracies will see increased political participation. Well, a liberal democracy, a country that has that, does not have political conditions like this. Okay, typically in a liberal democracy, people are happy, right? They can participate in government and the government is not so repressive. So I'm going to cross that off. Isolated societies will easily adopt more democratic practices. Well, this doesn't make any sense because social media use kind of removes isolation from the equation, right? When you can communicate online, you're not isolated. You're not stopped from communicating just because of a political border. So we're going to cross that off. Technologically advanced societies will actively encourage political corruption. This doesn't make any sense for a couple of reasons, right? But a technologically advanced society that has access to social media, why would they be online encouraging the governments to do the wrong thing? Right? That's like the opposite of the basic theme of this source. So we're going to cross that off. Number one is the best choice, right? Repressive governments, meaning the ones that do bad things, since social media is around, it's going to have a hard time maintaining power, right? People are going to put pressure on that government to do the right thing. So number one is our best answer for question 26. Okay, questions 27 and 28 refer to this graph and to this passage. So let's make some sense of the two sources before we look at the questions. So if we look at the graph here, it says projected world population in billions. That's the y-axis, right? So population going from 0 billion to 2 billion to 4 billion, etc. And on the x-axis, we have years. So it looks like population is growing far more rapidly for less developed countries and far more gradually growing for more developed countries. So when I say less developed country, you're probably going to think of things like third world country or developing country, maybe countries like in Latin America, whereas more developed countries could be like first world nations or developed nations or places like Western European countries or the United States of America. So a general theme to keep in mind when you're looking at this is that typically wealthy countries, meaning the developed countries, have lower birth rates. So let's go ahead and write that down. For more developed countries, lower birth rates. And we can attribute this to a lot of things. One thing you could attribute this to is that in more developed countries, people are more educated and maybe have better access to birth control. Therefore, maybe birth rates are lower in that regard, right? Maybe in more developed countries, people are really busy working, a lot of hours at their jobs, so they don't really have the time and energy to devote themselves to having larger families. Whereas in less developed countries, right, maybe they're still involved with agriculture. So having more kids means more people that can work on the farm. So maybe between lack of access to birth control and the desire for more farm workers, less developed countries, the poor countries, are going to have higher birth rates. Okay, so that's some backstory that explains why this chart looks the way it does. Let's look at the source here. So the source is called The Next Green Revolution, and that came out in October of 2014. And if you remember anything about the Green Revolution, the first one from the 1960s was about using more science and genetic engineering to produce more food. So I wonder if the source is about that. Maybe this source says, we don't have to fear this because we're growing more food. I don't know, let's take a look. Before those grim visions of global hunger could come to pass, the Green Revolution transformed global agriculture, especially wheat and rice. So just like I said, the Green Revolution means we're going to grow more wheat and rice and have a better chance of dealing with the rapid rise of the human population around the world. Through selective breeding, Norman Borlaug, an American biologist, created a dwarf variety of wheat that put most of its energy into edible kernels rather than long, inedible stems. So basically a more nutrient-rich breed of wheat is being grown as a result of scientific manipulation. The result, more grain per acre. Similar work at the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines dramatically improved the productivity of the grain that feeds nearly half the world. So basically, summarize this first paragraph, more technology, more science leads to more food. From the 1960s through the 1990s, yields of rice and wheat in Asia doubled. A yield is like how much you produce. So they're producing double over the course of these 30 years. Even as the continent's population increased by 60%, grain prices fell. That's an interesting statistic. So even though population is going up, meaning more demand for food, the prices fell. That just suggests a massive abundance of food. Okay, so like the opposite of shortages. The average Asian consumed nearly a third more calories, and the poverty rate was cut in half. Right, so less poor people. Still have poor people, but less because of the Green Revolution, at least according to this source. When Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize in the 1970s, the citation read, "More than any other person of this age, he helped provide bread for a hungry world." Okay, so again, it's interesting how these sources run parallel here in the Regents. This is showing a rapid population growth, and this is showing how we deal with it. According to this population graph, what is the approximate projected world population for 2050? Okay, so let's look at the chart here. I see 2050. I'll run my finger up the y-axis. Maybe I'll put a little dot right here. And I have to figure out what the population is going to be, right? The population's over here. So I'm just going to draw maybe a little dotted line across here, the best I can, and see what the number is. Approximate, right? So approximately right in the middle of 8 and 10 would be something like 9. So let's see if 9 is in our answer choices. Boom, yes it is. Okay, the estimate for world population would be 9 billion according to this chart by the year 2050. That should be pretty easy. According to this National Geographic article, why was Norman Borlaug awarded the Nobel Peace Prize? So why did they give this guy an award based on the source? He transformed global agricultural production. Well, he certainly did do that, and that is going to be our answer. He invented new ways to produce more food. But let's look at the other answers and see why they're wrong. He was able to decrease the surplus population in areas of famine. He didn't do that, right? He didn't decrease surplus population. He didn't get rid of people, right, to deal with the problem of overpopulation. He grew more food. So we're going to cross off number 2. He targeted poverty by providing food donations to the less fortunate. It's not in the source. He didn't make donations of food. He just pioneered the science so that people can grow more food for themselves. Choice 4. He ended famines by moving the production of grains to the Philippines. That doesn't make sense, right? Yes, they're going to grow rice in the Philippines, but they're still growing wheat in America. It's in the first source, right? He's an American biologist growing wheat. So it's not like wheat production moved to the Philippines. No, we're going to grow wheat in America. We're going to grow rice in the Philippines. And I wouldn't say that famine was ended, right? Poverty was cut in half. So there are still some poor people that cannot afford to feed themselves. So I wouldn't say that famine has gone away. So number 1, transformation of agriculture because of the Green Revolution. That's our answer. So number 1 for question number 28. Thank you so much for watching one of my Regents review videos in global history and geography. If you're looking to continue your studies, check out my playlists for videos on multiple choice questions, on CRQ questions, and on writing the Enduring Issues essay.